Hi everyone and welcome to my updated GoD Demon Hunter guide. This is still the best build on Demon Hunter and one of the best builds in the game in general, especially for solo farming. It can also be used in farm and speed farming. It is a pretty good speed meta going with 2 GoD Ages and 2 supports. And in general, this got the biggest buff in the whole patch in Season 24 because of the Ethereals, the buriza-do, which is the strongest Ethereal in the entire game. So there is a good reason to play Demon Hunter. It is the same old build from Season 21, but with a few new learnings and a few tweaks that will make it even better this time. So I will jump into the setup here. The set is the Gears of Dreadlands, which is where the name comes from, the god, the age. And this one allows you to shoot hanging arrows when you strafe. So there are a lot of complicated mechanics, but to make it simple, every time a strafe projectile hits, you will produce one hanging arrow. And you have to shoot hanging arrows manually to stack up the momentum bonus, which is the 2-piece bonus that will give you extra damage and extra speed. And you also get some damage reduction while strafing. So all of those bonuses are pretty neat. And momentum will be kept up by shooting at least once every 4 seconds. Typically, you want to shoot more, especially when you're pushing or DPSing. So essentially, you want to attack every around half second or so to do even more hanging arrows manually. The thing about the 4-piece bonus that produces the hanging arrows for you automatically is that it has a 9 frames cooldown, which is 150 milliseconds. So the maximum number of projectiles you can produce is 6.67 from the set, but you can get a few more hits when you attack manually as well. This is mostly relevant when you're pushing, but in farming you can sometimes use this to advantage and have this knowledge, and it also makes breakpoints and attack speed breakpoints quite important. There are a few key items that make this build really work, and that is the 9th series satchel, especially the quiver that gives you a 600% damage boost and up to 4 pieces for your hanging arrow. Usually it doesn't pierce with a 100% chance, and you're going to be using the devouring arrow rune, which gives it a 70% multiplicative damage boost when you hit a target. So this is really nice, so you can stack up to 350% damage on the final hit, and you have massive single target damage especially. GoD is not an AoE build, it's more like Impale Demon Hunter in the sense that you try to single out enemies and you fight small packs of monsters and you try to just nuke them down. So you're gonna see the bosses melt in less than a minute in some cases, and also elites can die really fast, but you don't really kill big packs of monsters very quickly. And the other core item here is the Hunter's Wrath, which gives you another attack speed bonus, which doesn't really do that much, but it also gives you a 200% damage bonus. This is usually accompanied by the Death Diggers, which is another 100 multiplier, so this is pretty neat. And this is also about it for what you need for the build. Most setups run Focus and Restraint for the extra damage, and you proc both of them automatically, so that is pretty neat. And there's also the Squirt's Necklace that you have to keep up as much as possible. This is one of the key items for pushing and how to distinguish yourself as a player. You don't have any protection for the Squirt's Necklace besides the smoke screen, so the main strategy here is essentially just don't get hit. There are some setups that run the Forge Ballista, and this can help you to keep it up, but this is mostly a thing for farming and not so much for pushing. In pushing, you usually go with the Valor's Bequest, which allows your strafe projectiles to pierce enemies and more often hit enemies exactly on the 9 frames cooldown of the 4-piece bonus. So this is the reason why Valor's Bequest is so good, but ultimately you want to go with Odyssey's End as your legendary weapon power, because this allows you to get in the entangling shot and deal a lot more damage from the Odyssey's End power, which gives you 150% additive damage. This setup is a bit harder to play, but it's not really the end of the world. What you need to know is that you need to entangle enemies for a little while, and then you need to swap between your 2 generators, because your God set will always fire the latest one. So essentially, when you prepare to pull, you are on entangling shot all the time until most stuff is entangled, which you can see on those little chains between the enemies. And then you shoot hanging arrows, and after around 3.5 seconds, you'll do 1 entangling shot and then swap back to hanging arrow all the time for another 3.5 seconds and repeat. This way you keep up the buff permanently, because whenever you hit one target, you will refresh it on all of them. The good part is, to get started, you don't really need any weapon legendary power. You can just get any buriza-do, for example, or any other big weapon, and just use that and cube the Dawn and have the quiver equipped. So this is definitely a viable strategy at the start, because especially when you're speed farming, you don't really care too much. Lastly, we have the Raptor Clarity here, which is the number one item for Demon Hunter's toughness. This is very nice and activates all the time automatically. For your legendary gems, number 1, Simplicity Strength. This one heals you and is a massive damage bonus for every generator build. Then there's the Bane of the Trap, which will usually be used for pushing. And for example, in the Odyssey's End setup, you don't want to run Taeguk like you usually do on a channeling setup. Here it has the saves, because Odyssey's End 150% damage bonus is additive, which is the same category as Taeguk. But typically this third gem would be the Taeguk here, and that also gives you a massive additive damage bonus and a bit of armor. In T16 those gems can also be replaced, you don't really need that much damage, so Boon of the Hoarder is an option there. You can even go Wrath of Lightning, for especially in bounties. This is a nice option to just speed up even more. Lastly, your choice for the Kanai's Cube jewelry slot is your own, but ultimately Conventional Elements is always the way to go. It is simply a massive damage buff that you don't want to miss, and Elusive Ring is an option, but this is only something for beginners, and later on maybe for farming with Fortress Ballista and Squirts if you want to make it easy and smooth, but you're not going to have the best results. There's also some setups that run all guilds instead of Raptor Clarity and have a Ring of Heroic Grandeur in the cube, but I would not recommend this at all. This is also again something that drops a lot of toughness and makes you quite squishy and is not really necessarily better. For your skill and passive setup, Strafe with either Drifting Shadow or Rocket Storm is used to produce the gold 4-piece bonus, so you can run with either. Usually Drifting Shadow is for farming for the movement speed, and Rocket Storm is for pushing for slightly higher frequency of projectiles. Then Hanging Arrow, Devouring Arrow, the main skill. There is also Shatter Shot, the lightning rune, which can be used at least in T16. If you're farming really low end content, you have a bit more AoE coverage. Vengeance with Dark Heart gives you 40% extra damage and 50% damage reduction. Have it permanently up with at least 37% cooldown reduction and the Dawn. Then you have 3 other skills which are open and not really required. But most of the time, Smokescreen is the way to go. There are a lot of people that like Shadow Power, but I would definitely not recommend this. The main reason for this is the Squirt's Necklace. You want to keep your Squirt's Necklace as much as possible, and you have no chance of doing that with Shadow Power. So you definitely want to learn to play around this. Then you have Preparation, Focus Mind, which gives you the necessary fuel to activate your Smokescreen. And you have one last skill, which is going to be either Fan of Nice, Bladed Armor, or Shadow Power, Shadow Glide. If you are speed farming and you have maybe something like a Yank's Recurve equipped for extra resource cost reduction, there can be the Wolf Companion, or ultimately the Entangling Shot with Heavy Burden. The main passes you always want to use basically are Ambush, and then for pushing especially also Numbing Traps. This one doesn't need you to apply slow, but Hanging Arrow applies it for you, even though it doesn't slow. Wake is a very strong offensive passive, and for example with the buriza-do you can go Archery, which is also a pretty neat offensive passive. Or when you're dual wielding, it's also pretty nice. There are some more options like Tactical Advantage for speed farming. You can go Awareness. You can go Hot Pursuit for 20% movement speed if you're finding T16 or bounties. So that's a bit up to you. So you mostly just want to have Ambush at all times, and then when you're in greater, it's also Color Weak. Now to talk about the breakpoints a little bit. You see here on the first table the 9 frames breakpoint, which is starting at 1.50 attacks per second. This is typically the breakpoint you want to aim for with a two-handed weapon, both with crossbows and with a normal bow. So this applies to both the Odyssey's End setup and whatever crossbow you can run. In fact, you can just run any crossbow and you're gonna have a fine setup already. So this is also what I mentioned about the Buriza. You don't need any legendary power on it necessarily. It's just a bit of an optimization later on. But you can just go for a high DPS version, basically the first Buriza you find, and you're gonna be okay. And that should happen very easily once you start the season. So here we have the 9 frames breakpoint, which is exactly the same cooldown as the 4-piece GoD set, and it goes until 1.67 attacks per second. So this is the range of attack speed that you want to have, Typically you reach this automatically with a crossbow when you just have the quiver, the paragons, and basically one attack speed roll. And with a bow, in fact, you have to remove attack speed from your paragons to stay in that range, because the bow is a bit faster. So something to be aware about, and it's also not doable if your quiver has 20% attack speed, because this is already too high. The maximum is 19% with 0% in paragons and no other rolls if you're wearing a bow. When you're dual wielding or you're with one-handed crossbow, you will typically end up on the 7 frames breakpoint, which means that you will hit an enemy after 7 frames, and then you will hit again after 14 frames, which is when the cooldown is not ready yet. So you do get a 4-piece projectile on only every second strafe tick, and there's a bit of a gap. Realistically, this doesn't always matter too much, because you don't always produce GoD 4-piece bonuses exactly on the 9 frames breakpoint, because you will be moving around. There's like different projectile flying animation time, and you will not always hit exactly on the right frame. So this applies also to the crossbow and the bow setups. It's just in the perfect scenario where you get the perfect amount of projectiles, but realistically it is so erratic that there's almost no way to really predict it and do it in the perfect time. So while on paper the perfect breakpoint sounds extremely good, in reality it doesn't matter too much. The most important thing is just to avoid the 8 frames breakpoint, because this is simply a massive damage loss if you have a crossbow or a bow and you have too much attack speed. Lastly, a few words about the buriza-do cannon. So this one is a massive weapon and has this freeze effect. A lot of people have asked me if it's viable to roll off all your critical hit chance because of this. Hits against frozen enemies are always critical hits effect. The answer is absolutely not. Also, you don't really want to run with a Z-Necro in case you have any plans like that. If you go in groups, you want to go with the typical setup of ZDH and Z-Barb as your supports. Z-Necro doesn't really provide a lot of value because you already have really high crit chance anyway. In a typical two-handed weapon plus quiver setup with perfect crit rolls, you're going to have 64% crit chance already. If you have a ZDH in a party, you get another 18%, so you're at over 80% crit chance anyway when you're farming in parties. And even in solo, you're going to have a pretty high crit chance. In speed farming, you will generally freeze stuff quite a lot, but it's not to the point where everything is permanently frozen and you have this 100% crit buff active at all times. And even if you do, the overall damage bonus is somewhere between 20% in groups and 50% in solo. So you don't really want to go with a lot of extra freeze, you don't really want to roll off your crit chance, you definitely don't want to go with frost burns. So just be aware about this. You gear as normal, maybe you roll off a crit roll on the ring or something like that, but in the end it doesn't really help you much, and all you can get is like some other dexterity roll or some physical damage roll in your ring, and this is about it. So this is all there is to say about the setup. If you want to check out the different variations in detail, go check the D3 planner. Here for the gameplay, you mentioned a few things already about the momentum, about Odyssey's End. In general, just be aware that the pushing works very differently on this build than it does on most other builds because of the very small AoE. So you don't really have this huge nuke potential when you have big area damage, when you have like big monster packs. In fact, with the Odyssey's End and also with the Skirt's Necklace, you are actually a bit in trouble when you have too many enemies. So you don't need to go for big pulls like most other builds. You rather just fight a few enemies at a time, you entangle them, you dodge around to keep up your amulet, and you will deal the most damage that way. Try to jump into Oculus rings whenever it's possible and when it's safe, because I want to increase your damage by up to 85%. And aside from that, just keep moving at all times, make sure you don't get hit. So while the idea of the setup is fairly straightforward, it is quite hard to execute in some cases because of elite affixes, because of archers shooting at you, because of ghosts that you need to dodge somehow. So all this really helps you to optimize your DPS if you perform all these little things well. And the more you keep up your squirts, the better you do the rotations, the more damage you will deal, and you'll squeeze out those last few GR tiers. In farming, all of this is not too relevant because typically you're going to run T16 where your damage doesn't matter, or you're going to run speed GRs where you might have the Fortress Blaster to protect you, but even there you don't want to get hit by the big attacks that drop your squirts. so be aware of that. And that's also it for this guide. So I hope you enjoyed my updated GoD guide here. I will have a big post on Maxroll about this build. It is one of the most complicated ones in terms of mechanics, and I try to break it down in the easiest way here, but you can also go more into the details if you want. So go check that out, and hope you have a wonderful season in season 24 with the Ethereals. GoD is going to feel amazing with the Buriza. I've been trying it on the PTR. It is extremely strong. It is just feeling great, and you'll enjoy it, I'm sure. So hope you liked the video, and see you guys next time.